And while they ooze history and all that ambiance that you get, to have a small town like this with a community center right here, you are blessed. You are blessed. So very, very nice. You know what I want to do? I usually do this when I'm at a historical society. And no one has heard me speak before, right? Okay. Here, you have? Where?
Cooperstown.
In Cooperstown. Well, then you can't play.
Oh, no, I know I can't play.
You can't play. You can sit and laugh in the right places and cry in the right places, but you can't play. All right? Here's the deal. I am going to ask you a trivia question. Okay? Then we'll put it out of our minds, and at the end I'll answer it, or hopefully you will answer it. I will couch it by saying this. Probably in the last year and a half, on my book tours and signings, I maybe have spoken in front of 5,000 or 6,000 people over the year and a half. Nobody has ever answered this trivia question correctly. And I have a feeling that it's going to happen here. I have a feeling it's going to be this lady in the green sweater. I don't know why I'm feeling that, ma'am. I am, but in any case. So here's the deal. I'll ask you this question, then just put it away, and we'll revisit it at the end of my talk, okay? It will sound fairly simple until you get deep, deep into it and you can't get out of it. There are 6 United States presidents buried in the state of New York. Can you name them? There are 6 U.S. presidents buried in the state of New York. Can you name them? Now, I also know that at the end, as a room, we'll get it. But I have never had one person stand up and say, I got it. I must tell you, I spoke, I'm living in Oneonta 30 years now, but I'm originally from Sydney, New York, down in Delaware County. And I had the wonderful opportunity to be invited back there and speak in front of the Retired Sydney Teachers Association last year at the Sydney Country Club. All right, and I graduated I graduated in 1967, so it was nice to go back. And I sat there, and before I looked out, I didn't recognize too many people after all those years, too many teachers. But boy, I couldn't wait to ask them a trivia question. And they did not get it, and I felt so good about that, I got to tell you. My teachers not be able to get it. Okay, let me tell you about my little book, Great Graves of Upstate New York. This book has exploded. I can't begin to tell you, as I've traveled around the state, talking about this book, I get a lot of questions, all right? And people say, how'd you get into it? You must be into genealogical stuff. No, I could care less about that. You do the family trees, or you do the grave rubbings. No, don't do any of that. The reason I got into this book was I stumbled into it. In 1986, my grandfather died. He was 100 years old. He was the shoemaker in my hometown of Sydney for 79 years. And my mom and dad and I packed him up, and we took him to Elmira to bury him at Woodlawn Cemetery in Elmira. There was just 15 of us there. And after we buried my grandfather, my dad and I took a little stroll around the cemetery for a minute to collect our thoughts before we headed back to Sydney. And I was flabbergasted to go 500 feet and run into the grave of Mark Twain. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. Why? I mean, we all associate Mark Twain with the riverboats and the paddle wheels and the Mississippi, and here he is in Elmira, New York. Why? Well, at first I thought, well, maybe it's a different guy named Mark Twain, but that's Mark Twain. I've got a photograph of him in here. His picture, his image is on the stone, his story is around the bottom, and I find out later that Mark Twain is buried in Elmira, pretty much for the same reason my grandfather is buried in Elmira, because that's where their second wives wanted him. So that's where it was. So I tucked it away in the back of my mind, end of story. 3 months later, the great singer Kate Smith dies. Believe it or not, I was a friend of Kate Smith's for 20 years. She was a pip. was great. And I'm going to tell you how I met Kate Smith. In 1967, my mom and dad packed all 10 of us into a great big huge country squire wagon, and we headed up the brand new Northway to Montreal to Expo 67. You remember that? Okay. As we got up to the end of the state, we ran out of gas in Lake Placid, New York. All right? And we didn't sputter to a stop in the middle of the brand new Northway, but we needed gas. So we pull off, and while we're getting gas, my mother happens to pick up the Lake Placid newspaper. And there, on the front page of the newspaper, is a big photograph of Kate Smith running a cash register at a gift shop on Main Street. Now, to make the long story short, Kate Smith summered for 40 years in Lake Placid. She had her own home on an island in the middle of the lake. The rest of the time, she lived in New York City. She was arguably one of the most famous women of the 20th century. God bless America. Kate Smith had a godmother who was very elderly, who had a gift shop on Main Street called the Lavender Shop. And her godmother, Flora Donovan, had a heart attack and fretted that she was going to lose the business. And Kate said, I'll run it. I'm here all summer, I'll run it. And of course, once it got out that the great Kate Smith was running a little gift shop on Main Street in Lake Placid, the wire services, AP, UPI, everybody picked it up. And that's the picture on the front page of the Lake Placid newspaper. So my mother and father turned to all of us kids and say, who wants to go into Lake Placid to see Kate Smith? And we all said, we don't want to do that. We want to go to Expo 67. So we go into Lake Placid to see Kate Smith. We pull up out front. Little tiny building. By the way, it is now a branch of the Lake Placid Library, right in the middle of downtown, maybe this size, certainly not this tall. All 10 of us go tumbling in the front door. It is completely empty. We stood there for about a long 30 seconds, when all of a sudden from the back we heard, I'll be right out! That was Kate Smith. Before long, here she came, charging down the aisle. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Thanks for coming. Hello, hi. We stood there. My mother and father took a moment and mentioned to Kate how much they have enjoyed her music all the years and her entertainment, and that they saw it in the paper, and they just wanted to stop by to say thank you. And Kate was very gracious, and we said goodbye. And before we left, Kate Smith looked right at me. You have no idea who I am, she said to me. And I looked back. Remember, she is 60, I'm 17. I looked right back at her and I said, no ma'am, I don't. And she said, okay, I'll make a deal with you. And she went around behind the counter and she took out a record album and she signed it to me. There it is. All these years later. She signed it to me and she said, right there, to Chuck and Kate Smith. She said, take this record album. You remember record albums? Yeah. She said, take this record home and listen to it, will you? And if you like it, let me know. And I said, okay. And I thanked her. Off we went to Expo 67. 3 or 4 weeks later, my mother says, did you listen to that record album yet? And I said, no. She said, go upstairs and listen to it. I did, and I loved it. I loved it. We had a musical family with our own band. I knew music, and that was good music. And I wrote her a note. Dear Kate, thank you for being so gracious to my family. I really enjoyed the record. Sincerely, Chuck the Imperial, Sydney, New York. End of story, I thought. 2 weeks later, here comes the mailman to our home, with a letter for me from Kate Smith. I opened it up, and it said, "Dear Chuck, thank you for your thank you. By the way, I'm going to be on the Dean Martin show in 2 weeks. Would you do me a favor and take a look at it and write me a note and let me know what you think about it?" And that, believe it or not, was the beginning of a 20-year friendship between me and Kate Smith. 3 years later, I moved to Los Angeles to become a great big famous singer. I'm sure you all have my albums too. And while I was there, it was that wonderful cycle of television that we all miss so much. I just know it. The variety shows. They were on all the time. Hollywood Palace and Ed Sullivan and Dean Martin and Smothers Brothers, Sonny and Cher, Donnie and Marie, whatever. And Kate Smith was on them all. And every time she was on those shows, the ratings went through the roof. And every time she was on those shows, there were 4 tickets for me and my friends at the front desk at the studio. And we'd go, and we'd sit, and we'd watch her sing God Bless America, and we'd go backstage afterwards and visit, maybe have a coffee with her, and off we go. I was not supposed to like Kate Smith. I was 17. I had hair out to here and wore Herman Munster shoes. I was a hippie. She was the God Bless America lady. But we hit it off. In 1976, Kate Smith was at the busiest year of her life, our nation's bicentennial. What better way to end a bicentennial program than, ladies and gentlemen, live, here's Kate Smith singing God Bless America. And she did it all over the country. She performed in August in Kansas City. She sang God Bless America, and the next day she went into a diabetic coma, and she vanished for 10 years to the day of singing God Bless America when she dies in 1986. Kate Smith left her fortune to her church in Lake Placid with one stipulation. Those of us that knew Catherine knew that she did not like to go underground. She lived in New York City. She'd cross herself if she went into a tunnel. She would only go on a subway with others. And so her stipulation was, you get my money, I get an above-ground mausoleum. The problem was, for 100 years, mausoleums have been banned in the cemetery. And the church wrestled for 1 year on what to do about this woman's money. Finally, after a year, they agreed, they took her money, and they built this huge pink 6-foot-tall mausoleum. There's a photograph in the book. And I am invited to come and sit with family and friends at her funeral. When we got there that day, there were hundreds. And Kate Smith's mausoleum is covered with a big canvas. And when we sat down, they took the canvas off. And there across the top, it says Catherine E. Smith. And that was the start of this book. Because I thought to myself, how many people are going to come through this cemetery and never make the connection that Catherine E. Smith is the great Kate Smith? And then, what the heck is Mark Twain doing in Elmira anyways? So on that long ride home, I started to think, who else is buried in New York State? And I made a mental list to eat up the miles. I knew that James Fenimore Cooper was, because our school groups would always go there in Cooperstown. Remember the trivia question at the beginning? I'm going to give you one right now. It's the one you all got anyways, Franklin D. Roosevelt. I knew that he was buried in Hyde Park. And I knew a couple of others, and I went home and I wrote them down. And pretty soon I noticed that I kept, anytime I heard about a famous person being buried in New York State, I wrote it down. I wrote it down. Pretty soon I had 100 names. Pretty soon I had 300 names. Pretty soon I had 500 names of famous people buried in New York State. Therefore, a book had to come out of this information. Now, when it came book time, I was told I had too much information. They said, you got to change your focus just a little bit, because there are already books about the famous people buried in New York City. But you know what? There are no books about famous people buried in my beloved upstate New York. That was the book. Now I had to do a couple of things. First of all, I had to get the people I wanted to put in here. He said, give me your 50 best stories. Well, it was like picking my favorite kids. I got to 50 and I said, I can't leave these out. Then I got to 55 and I can't leave these out. These are good stories. That's why I always say, this is the only book you'll ever see in a bookstore that's a top 70 list of anything. Because I hit 70 and my wife said, well, you write the darn book. And I did. Now, I had to pick these stories. Let me just tell you the great water cooler discussion that comes out of this. People always say to me, who is the most famous person in your book? Well, I have to tell you who the most famous person in my book is, according to me. Many will say it's Franklin D. Roosevelt. How much more famous can you get than FDR? But he's not the most famous person in my book. And here's my test. I really believe that I could walk into the middle of the most remote town on the face of the earth. I could go into the outback of Australia, and I could stand on a dusty street corner, and I can hold up a black and white picture of Franklin D. Roosevelt in this hand, and in the other hand, I'll hold up a black and white picture of a crazy lady shoving chocolates in her mouth at a conveyor belt, and everybody's going to say, that's Lucy. And that's why I think Lucille Ball is the most famous person in my book. A lot of people didn't know that she's buried in upstate New York, out in western New York in Jamestown. Now I have another problem. Where's upstate? All right, now I'll tell you, if you're like me, I know how you feel when you hear somebody say, yeah, I'm from upstate, up in Westchester. Brother, that ain't upstate. After the winter we've had, right? No way. So I had to come up with my own version of upstate New York. So my upstate New York is, on the south, it's the Tappan Zee Bridge. On the east, it's New England. On the north, it's the St. Lawrence River. And then, of course, the great cities in western New York. Off I go on this book. Now, I got my information for this book before computers. I did this book the hard way. I looked it up in a book, I got in a car, and I went to the cemetery. And I did it on Saturday mornings. And I did it with my two little girls, a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. Every Saturday morning, Frances and Katie, Katie named after Kate Smith, Frances and Katie, off we go on Saturday to some cemetery around the state. Well, I'll tell you, it's very interesting because I spoke about 3 weeks ago at a historic society in, where was it, in Kingston. My daughter, Katie, those 5 and 8-year-olds now are 28 and 25, all right? She was home on a college break, in her senior year of college. And she said, Dad, can I go on a book talk with you? I said, sure, I got one coming up tomorrow in Kingston, let's go. So we went, big crowd. Katie sat up front. And as I got to this part of my talk, I thought to myself, you know what? I wonder what they thought of that when they were little. And it just dawned on me. I never asked her. And so I said, Katie, will you come up in front of the crowd and tell them what it was like when you were a little girl and we did cemetery trips on Saturdays? And she was beautiful, of course. She came up and she said, you know what, Dad, it was a little weird. because on Monday, when my friends all said, "What'd you do this weekend?" She said, "I usually made up a story." And said we went and visited some relatives. But she said that I look back at it now as an adult, she said, "I knew who B.F. Goodrich was before anybody else." And we had wonderful times in the car, and we wouldn't have traded them for anything. And before I get into the meat of the book, I wanted to tell you about a certain group that I owe a big thank you to. And I thank them in the front of my book, and I thank them anonymously because I don't know who they are, frankly. I never got a name. But I can't tell you how many times, after a long day on the road, with two kids who about had it with me, we finally got to the cemetery. And I knew from my research that this person was in there. But just imagine yourself going to a cemetery, almost any cemetery, and walking the rows looking for a stone. That's a long day, especially in a big cemetery. So usually what I would do is I would write the name down on a piece of paper and I'd give it to Katie. And I'd write it down and I'd give it to Francis. And Francie go this way and Katie go this way and I go down the middle. And before long, "I found him, Dad!" And they'd get a quarter. So they loved it. But you know who was valuable to me? I can't tell you how many times when I thought I'd made a wasted trip a long way from home, when all of a sudden I'd hear, "Here comes the guy on the right along that takes care of the cemetery. Hey, mister, my girls and I, we're looking for, and the son's going, do you have any idea?" "Sure, this is my cemetery, come on." Off we go. There he is right there. I can't tell you how many times that happened. And as I look back now, I realize it because I was taking an interest in their work. The cemetery was beautiful. Somebody was talking to them. I imagine it gets pretty lonely all day working by yourself at a cemetery. So I thank these guys on the riding lawnmowers for saving my butt so many times. Now, let me give you a couple of quick ones, my favorites in here. Who am I going to? I have an idea. Let's do this. Here's a lady, 1903, 60s years, she's in her 60s, retired school teacher. She gets up one morning, she throws her legs over the table, over her bed, she puts her head in her hands. She said, "What, is this it? Is this it? Nobody knows who I am. I have no fame. Has my life been of value to anybody? I want to be famous." So she does what every 63-year-old retired school teacher does. She puts on her stockings, gets in her best dress, puts on a string of pearls and a flowered hat, grabs a bicycle pump and a blacksmith's anvil, and crawls into a barrel. The neighbors nail her shut and kick her into the Niagara River. The neighbors all run down to the bottom now. She vanishes for 17 minutes. Boink. Up she pops. Annie Edson Taylor, the first person to go over Niagara Falls and live. The neighbors now, they throw a rope out and they drag the barrel in. By now the newspaper has come. You know, they put a board out and they knock the end of the barrel down. And here she comes. She's alive. She's soaking wet. The hat is still on. The newspaper man takes the picture. Goes around the world. Ma'am, do you have something we can get a quote from you for tomorrow's paper? You know what her quote was? "Ain't nobody ever ought to do that again." The next day, the Buffalo Exposition is going on in Buffalo. This is the World's Fair of its time, the biggest event in our country. She goes there. They put her in a tent, in a throne, with a flowered hat and 3,000 people pay a nickel to walk by her, she never says a word. She's the biggest hit of the event. She writes a book. I went over the falls and lived. Nobody cared. Within a year, she was broke. Within 2 years, she's blind. She finally dies, and she's buried in a potter's field, in an unmarked grave. Over the years, somewhere, I had heard that they had put a stone on Annie Edson Taylor's grave. Come on, girls. We're going to that. We go there. I know the cemetery. And I'm there. And I'm looking. And I'm looking. And I'm looking. Hey, mister. My girls and I, we traveled a very long way, son. And we're looking for Annie Edson Taylor. Oh, yeah. How about? Go around the back, around the big tree in the back, and we stop. And there it is. A patch of grass in the shape of a triangle with 15 stones in it. All the stones are identical, except for one in the middle is about this much taller. That's the grave of Annie Edson Taylor. On the gravestone, it tells her story of going over the falls and living. There's a photo in the book of it. The 14 other stones are people who went over Niagara Falls and died. And their stories are written on each stone. Fascinating. I said to the guy, thanks a lot, man, I couldn't have found this without you. He said, well, you know, they call this Hero's Corner. He said, me and the boys call it Fool's Corner. But as I stood there the very first time, and I looked at the grave, and I read the story, and I hear the falls out of my ear, the falls that she went over, it became real to me. It became real, these wonderful, exciting stories that I was uncovering in great graves of upstate New York. Let's go even farther north now. I'll tell you another one. Does the name Mary Edwards Walker mean anything to anybody? Okay. Mary Edwards Walker, her father is a liberal guy. Tells his girls, this is before the Civil War, tells his girls, especially Mary, who loved him, if you continue to dress like a woman, you will never make it in this man's world. She believed her daddy. And from her teenage days till she died well in her 80s, she dressed like a man. And I'm not talking about slacks. I'm talking about men's shoes, men's suit, men's vest, silk top hat. Was she wacky? No. Although, on the day she got married, there were 2 people on the altar wearing men's suits. And whenever I say, was she crazy? One time somebody yelled out, no, but her husband was. She was brilliant. She was the second woman in America to graduate from medical college, right behind Elizabeth Blackwell. Here comes the Civil War. She joins the Union Army. She's a battlefield surgeon. We can't even imagine that. In a war where you saw the person you were killing, what was it like to be a battlefield surgeon? That was Mary Walker. She was captured by the Confederates. In those days in the war, they had a trade kind of a thing. You got a captain, I'll give you a captain. You got a lieutenant, I'll give you a lieutenant. Not for her. We got Mary Edwards Walker. We want all 19 of our battlefield surgeons back. And the trade was done. After the war, Mary Edwards Walker received the Congressional Medal of Honor. And she went back to Oswego, New York, to her home. But you know what? That's only the first part of the Mary Edwards Walker story. 25 years later, in their infinite wisdom, the War Department decided that they were going to change the rules on the Medal of Honor. They wanted to ensure that this medal was so rarely given that it really was, in fact, the highest military honor there was. That's okay. But they made it retroactive, and they decided to take some back. Now, I always imagine me being in my first day of the service. Private D'Imperio, I want you to go all the way to where New York State ends. I want you to find a woman that dresses like a man. And I want you to take her Medal of Honor back. Yes, sir. Now, I wasn't there, but the good folks of Oswego will tell you that she threw his butt out of town. And for the rest of her life, she walked the streets of Oswego, New York, in her full man suit with her Medal of Honor around her neck. Come on, girls, we're going to Oswego. This one was easy. Because when you go to the cemetery, you know, when I say Mary Edwards Walker, I usually get the same look, just a... They know her in Oswego. There's wings of hospitals, there's streets named after her, there's honors named after her. And when you go to the cemetery, it says, Mary Edwards Walker grave, this way. And you follow it, and there it is. There's a photo in the book. And as you stand there, it moves you. It speaks to you. It has her name. It has her years of service. And there, chiseled on the stone, is the insignia of the Congressional Medal of Honor. And when you realize the fact that even to this day, she is the only woman in American history to receive the Medal of Honor, that's a good story. Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. Let me just tell you this one. I got a horse in here. It's a great one. It's a good story. It's a horse out of Binghamton, New York. All right, 1914. There's a guy in Binghamton, New York, who was the wealthiest guy there. His name was Willis Kilmer. Willis Kilmer made his fortune by concocting the #1 medicinal product of its day, something called swamp root. Maybe some of you had it on the way in here this morning. I had a swamp root. He was the founder of the Binghamton Press newspaper, the #1 paper in the Southern Tier. He had a lot of dough. And on South Side, Binghamton, he had a horse farm. He was a bon-vivant and a raconteur and a horseman and a millionaire. He had a big old horse farm. And he wanted to put a horse in the Kentucky Derby, and by God, he was going to do it. And all of his people said, Kilmer, you don't have a horse that can run in the Derby. He said, yes, I do. I have a horse named Sunbriar. That horse isn't fast enough. Yes, it is. So he got Sunbriar. He bought his spot in the Derby. He got Sunbriar out. Sunbriar's running and running and running. Never even near times for a Kentucky Derby. He calls in the horse whisperers. What am I going to do? I'm going to be laughing stock. What am I going to do? They say, you know what, Kilmer? Get him a running partner. Getting him a running partner. Kilmer says, go get me something. Now, let's go. 2 days later, they back the horse wagon up, and here comes a horse. A sorrowful looking horse. He was a swayback. You could see his ribs. He had one ear up and one ear down. But he had a fire in his eye. The horse's name was Exterminator. Kilmer said, Exterminator? that old bag of bones, that's what they call them, old bones. Get them going. Sunbriar running. Exterminator running. Pulling back, going forward. Pulling back, going forward. Sunbriar faster and faster. A month before the Derby, Sunbriar sprains his leg and is out. And all the other horse people say, we want your spot in the Derby, Kilmer. Kilmer says, I paid for it. That's my spot. I'm running a horse in the Derby. Who are you going to run? Now, I wasn't there, but he had a round porch on the second level of his mansion that overlooked his horse farm. And I can see him there with his handlebar mustache, his glass of whiskey, and his long brown cigar, looking over the horses that day. And he came to Exterminator, Old Bones. And I know Old Bones was chomping on a wad of grass thinking, oh brother, what am I getting into now? He said, that's the horse that's running in the Derby. Exterminator. He had never run a race. Kilmer says, get him out, let's go, tomorrow. Mr. Kilmer, I'm sorry, sir, but we can't get him out of the stable. What do you mean you can't get him out of the stable? Yeah, he didn't eat yesterday either. What are we going to do, Mr. Kilmer? Calls the horse whisperers up. They say, the only thing I know is what worked before. Get him a running partner. Kilmer gives $1,500 to his trainer and said, get me something tomorrow. The trainer comes back with a Shetland pony named Peanut. They put him in the stable. The next morning, Exterminator's raring to go, and out they go, and they're inseparable. The big giant horse and little Peanut, inseparable. Derby day. Exterminator goes off at the longest odds of the Derby. 30-1 odds in his first race. We all know the ending, don't we? He won it. He won the Kentucky Derby, and they brought the roses back to Binghamton. Now, I have to tell you, I spoke in front of the New York State Librarians Association, and this next little vignette that I wanted to tell, a little old lady in the back raised her hand, and she said, Chuck, I was there. I was there. I said, well, you want to come up and share it with us? Exterminator went on to run 100 races. He won half, placed in the others, big winner in the Horse Racing Hall of Fame. Exterminator and Peanut together forever. They retired. Exterminator after he sprained his ankle. And Exterminator lived his life out in Binghamton. And on the horse's birthday, every year, they would bring the horse down to the fence, and all the kindergarten children in Binghamton would go over, and they would all put paper hats on, including the horse. They'd give the horse a carrot cake, and they would all sing happy birthday to the horse. And Peanut would be right there with his little paper hat on too. And this woman was a kindergartner who did that. And she remembered it, and she shared it with the group. It was great. 1943, the war is going on. What are we going to do? What can we do at home about World War II? Some of you may be old enough to remember or old enough to have heard about war bond rallies. War bond rallies, that's what we can do. We can throw money at the war. All right, let's do it. 1943, let's have a war bond rally. The biggest war bond rally ever. Where are we going to do it? Belmont Racetrack. Okay, that'll hold 75,000 people. They have it. October 3rd, 1943. It's called Back the Attack Day. All the big singers sing. All the big bands play. Every radio station carries it live. It's a sellout. It's packed. As they raised more money that day than any other day for a war bond rally. And how do you think it ends? I wasn't there, but in my mind's eye, it ends like this. And now, coming down the back stretch, making the final turn, it's the great exterminator. His head is held high. He sees the finish line. Coming by the grandstand. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the great exterminator. In the last year of his life, he could barely move. At the scene of so many of his great triumphs, here comes exterminator. 75,000 people stand and scream. And Peanut's running right next to him. All the way down. It's a good story. A lot of people will say when I get done, yeah, well, you know, it must be so hard to go into a cemetery and try and find all these graves. Not for exterminators. In Binghamton, they have a big zoo called the Ross Park Zoo. And if you just drive by the entrance of the Ross Park Zoo 1 mile, you'll see a sign that says Whispering Pines Pet Cemetery. You don't even have to get out of your car. Just turn to your right and look, and the very first stone, there's a photo in the book, the very first gray stone has the etching of a magnificent horse's head on it. That's the grave of exterminator. And right behind it is Peanut. It's a good story. I want to close by telling you this. There, obviously, I told you the Kate Smith connection. I didn't know these people. They were all dead. But there was one other person in this book that I met. And I will never forget it as long as I live. And he is my favorite story in this book. For a long time, I was the guy who sang the national anthem all over my area. It's just something I did. And at State University of New York in Delhi, my good friend was the director of admissions over there. I sang the national anthem over there 100 times. Whenever he had an event, sporting event, Charlie, can you come over? Yeah, I'll be there. I got a call from him one day. He said, can you come over and sing the national anthem on Saturday? I said, yeah, I'll be there. What's going on? He said, it's a big deal. There's going to be 3,000 people here. It's the dedication of our new multi-million-dollar library. It's going to be packed. Can you do it? I said, sure. He says, okay, just one thing, Charlie. When you come over, there's going to be a line of folding chairs on the stage. The Lieutenant Governor of New York is the keynote speaker. The President of SUNY is going to be here. He said, you're going to be at the very end, and you're going to start the show. I said, okay, no problem. He said, take a look at the man you're sitting next to. I said, why? Click. So I thought, what am I getting into now? Go back to 1933, in the South, the hard South, the segregated South, Fountain Hill, South Carolina. Okay? 13-year-old boy named Clayton. No father. Lots of kids. Mom's in trouble. Clayton works at the mill. He's 13 years old. He's clever. Because if you work at the mill, there's 2 ways to do it. You can work out in the broiling sun, or you can work your way inside and be in the mill inside. He's inside. He also tap dances on the streets of Fountain, South Carolina. For a penny a day. And boy, does that penny go a long way for his mom. One day, Clayton is standing inside the mill on his job. He had a dangerous job. Basically, he stood over a big hole, and all the wood would come in to get chopped. And if it got clogged, he had a big old heavy pole that he had to shove in there and unclog it. A rolling thunderstorm covers the mill. Boom, the power goes out. Everybody out of the mill! Boom, the power comes back on. And Clayton is standing in the hole. They drag him out, and they take him across the street where his mother amputates his leg. He goes into the bedroom, They shut the door. No hospitals, no medicine, no insurance. It's tough to be black in the hard South. And the family sits outside and they wait. And they wait. And they wait. And he never comes out of the room. And they can't figure it out. We know that he had a trauma. The guy lost a leg. He's a kid. But come on, it's got to be some ending to this where he comes back to life. A doctor comes in, visits town, hears about him, and comes out and says, Mom, you mind if I take a look at your boy? Yeah, he's right in the room there. Half an hour later, he comes out. He says, I think I have the answer. Clayton has made peace with the fact that he lost a leg and it's going to be a challenging life. But he has not made peace with the fact that he will never dance again. And at that point, I wasn't there, but in my mind's eye, the big uncle stands up. You know that big inappropriate uncle that we all have that always says something wrong at the wrong time? Stands up and he said, I've had enough. He goes into the kitchen, he picks up the broom, and he picks up the mop, and he picks up a wad of leather straps, and into the boy's bedroom he goes. He cuts off the bottom of the broom, he wraps it with a piece of leather on the bottom, he wraps it with a piece of leather on the top, and he said, here, that's your crutch. He takes the mop, and he cuts the bottom of the mop off, and he puts a piece of leather around the bottom, and he straps it to the boy's stump. He said, there's your legs. Now come back to life. And he leaves. And they wait. And they wait. And pretty soon, they hear noise. And pretty soon, the door opens. And young Clayton Bates comes back to life. And he goes back to the sidewalk. And he starts tap dancing again. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know about you, but I'm crossing the street to see a one-legged tap dancer. And everybody did. And the pennies a day turned into nickels and quarters and dollars a day. And he got older. And he was making all kinds of money. And people were coming from all over the country, all over the region to see him. And one day, here comes Vaudeville. Mr. Vaudeville shows up. Hey, man, did you see the one-legged tap dancer downtown? You got to go check that guy out. He goes down and he looks at him. He's blown away. He goes up to the boy and he says, what's your name, son? The boy says, Clayton Bates. Mr. Vaudeville thinks for a minute and says, no, that's not your name. Your name is Peg Leg Bates. You want to go around the world, son? Mom, can I? Yeah. Off he goes. Around the world, becoming the biggest star in vaudeville. One-legged tap dancer Peg Leg Bates. At the end of his act, he created a step that was all his own. He stood like this, perfectly straight, and he jumped his entire height. And he came down on his peg. And he stuck his other leg out over the crowd, and he did a big old bow. He did it for the Queen of England in London. She said, my good man, that was terrific. Would you do that again? He said, no, ma'am, I only do that one once a night. He got very wealthy. He had 13 pegs, each one a different color to match the different colored suits that he wore. He was on the Ed Sullivan Show 19 times, more than any other dancer. The #1 dance act on the Ed Sullivan Show was Peg Leg Bates. Now, I will just tell you this. Some of you that are computer savvy and enjoy spending some time on the computer, have you ever found YouTube? You know what that is, where you can type in and see videos? Go to YouTube and type in Peg Leg Bates. You'll see him dancing on the Ed Sullivan Show. You won't believe it. You won't believe it. That is the man sitting next to me in Delhi. On the day of the gathering, hundreds had assembled for the ceremony. I was seated at the very end of a long dais, and next to me sat a large, black, elderly man with a wooden leg. I soon learned it was Pegleg Bates. After I sang the national anthem, I returned to my seat, where Pegleg turned to me and whispered, "Good job on that song, man." I smiled. At the end of the ceremony, it was announced that Pegleg Bates was being awarded an honorary degree from SUNY Delhi. They listed all of his credits and achievements before they called him up to the podium. I could see in the sea of faces the hundreds of young students looking up at the stage, giving him that look that he must have seen everywhere he went. A look that said, "A one-legged tap dancer?" At the end of the speech, I leaned over, I gently pulled his chair back, and I helped him to his feet. Now in his 80s, he was dressed nattily in a black silk three-piece suit. He tucked his crutch under his arm, and he went out to receive his award. After, he told the audience, in a gentle whisper, of how proud he was to get this honor and of how wonderful his life had been. He reminded the many, many students there that day that there are no real barriers or obstacles in the road of life, only opportunities. And he reflected that if he could become a star with all that had been thrown at him since childhood, then certainly anybody could make it. He bowed, he thanked the crowd, and he began to return to his seat. And then something amazing happened. If I live to be 100 years old and you wheel me out into the solarium and say, "What happened next, John?" I will remember it like it was yesterday. As he turned to walk back, from way in the back of the room came a noise. A slow clap, 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 clap. Slowly at first, then louder and louder and more forcefully, the clap began to ring out through the building. Until everybody was clapping for the dancer. He turned to the huge crowd, and he gazed out over the young faces, and he finally realized they weren't clapping and chanting for him. A broad smile creased his face, and he slowly turned and went back to the speaker's microphone. He leaned in. I suppose you want to see this old one-legged tap dancer do his thing, don't you? A cheer went up. He chuckled, and he stepped back. Everyone rose in silence to watch him take a couple of seconds to prepare. I looked around, and I saw hundreds of people standing and craning their necks to get a look. All of the assembled dignitaries on the stage were standing, pushing back from their chairs, including the president of the SUNY system and the lieutenant governor of New York. Everybody saying, "What are we going to see?" And then it began. From the silence, a gentle tapping at first, almost like the knocking on a faraway door. And then it got louder and louder. Then the thuds became more pronounced, and his arms started to twitch a little bit. His good leg began to shuffle out a tempo while his crutch kept time and his peg beat out a bass. Soon the ears began to strip away as the master could be heard humming a song into the microphone, his suit jacket flailing wildly behind him as a crescendo of nearly 100 years worth of joy came bursting out of this legendary figure. At the dramatic end, he held his pose, just like in the old days. He broke into an enormous smile, threw his arms out, stuck his peg leg out over the crowd, and swept the stage with a floor-dusting bow. The huge crowd, with an average age of maybe 20, exploded in a tumultuous roar of approval. The old man collected himself and slowly walked back to his seat next to me and sat down. I leaned over and I got close to his sweaty, beaming face, and I whispered into his ear, Good job on that dance, man.